Well, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana says South Africa's stance on the Russia-Ukraine war has not impacted its access to financial markets. Godongwana has dismissed any impact in the foreseeable future and highlighted that South Africa is in communication with various countries in the G20 group.
Any attempt to arrest President Vladimir Putin is a declaration of war against Russia. That's the word from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. This after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the Kremlin chief.
Вот представим себе, понятно, что это ситуация, которая не реализуется никогда, да? Но тем не менее, вот представим себе, что она реализовалась. Действующий глава ядерного государства приехал вот на территорию, допустим, Германии и подвергся аресту. Что это? Объявление войны Российской Федерации. Подписали с нами документ. Теперь серьезно. Миновала ли угроза ядерного конфликта? Нет, не миновала. Она возросла. Каждый день поставок иностранного оружия на Украину в конечном счете приближает вот этот самый ядерный апокалипсис.
The ICC accuses Putin of a war crime for illegally deporting hundreds of children from Ukraine. The court is adamant that Putin holds individual responsibility.
Украина — это вообще часть России, скажем по-честному. Это часть России. Но в силу геополитических причин и в силу истории того, что произошло, мы долгое время мирились с тем, что мы живем по разные квартиры. В разных квартирах вынуждены с этим считаться, с этими границами, выдуманными, с территориями, которые всегда были частью не просто Российской империи. Это все была Российская империя, это понятно. Кроме там отдельных областей, которые там пришли в результате Второй мировой войны.
Well, joining me now to unpack this further is Professor Everisto Benyera from the Department of African Politics at the University of South Africa. Prof, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us this morning. You know, in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw, the West pretty much try to isolate Russia through economic sanctions, through, sort of diplomatic and public condemnation of Russia's actions. But I wonder, in your assessment, if you think that isolation has worked.
Thank you, Ntokozo, and good morning to the viewers. I think what we are witnessing right now is the escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war. Like you rightly said in your introduction, the war started with the economic isolation of Russia, and now what we are seeing is the escalation of the war into the legal realm. One of the most contested areas is when politics meet the law. And you can look at this as two sides of the same coin, the legal side and the political side. And countries are always trying to balance the two in international relations as to which one of the two gives them the most mileage in any situation. In this case is to shift the war in from the, not rather to shift, but to extend the war from the battlefield into the legal grounds. And here they are using the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court, its own, has been having multitudes and multitudes of its own problems, especially allegations that it targets Africa, that it is an extension of Western diplomacy, and that it is not there to ensure international criminal justice is attained, but rather it is an obstruction of international criminal justice. So what we are witnessing here in a nutshell is a new frontier being developed in this war, one in which children are being weaponized.
Indeed. Well, you talk about this transition from this sort of geopolitical war and stance into a legal terrain involving the International Criminal Court. South Africa finds itself at the center of that particular transition, Prof. The ICC having issued this warrant of arrest. We know that South Africa is set to host the BRICS summit August of this year. Russian President Vladimir Putin, for all intents and purposes, ought to be present. South Africa is still a member of the Rome Statute. How should the country respond?
Let me paint a brief background about the membership of BRICS vis-à-vis the International Criminal Court. There are only 2 members of the 5 BRIC member states that are full members of the International Criminal Court. It is only Brazil and South Africa. 3 of the 5 BRIC members are not members of the International Criminal Court: Russia, India, and China. South Africa is on the verge of opting out of the International Criminal Court. That leaves out Brazil as the only full ICC BRICS member. And if you rank the BRICS countries in terms of whatever mechanism you use, GDP, the number of nuclear weapons, the size of the economy, the size of the population, the rudimentary structure that appears is that China is the leading member, followed by Brazil, followed by India, followed by, the leading member is China, followed by Russia, followed by India, followed by Brazil, and then South Africa is the smallest member of the BRICS. So we see the 3 biggest BRICS members not being a member of the International Criminal Court. If we shift the same discussion to the United Nations Security Council, where there are ironically also 5 permanent members, we see that 3 members are not members of the International Criminal Court: China, Russia, and the United States. And only 2 members are full members of the International Criminal Court. That is the United Kingdom and France. And again, if we apply the same logic and try to rank the United Nations Security Council 5 permanent members, we see that the 3 top-ranked countries, China, Russia, and the United States, are also number 1, number 2, and number 3 in terms of nuclear weapon. So what I am trying to drive at here is that failing to arrest Omar al-Bashir was a less task for South Africa than trying to arrest Vladimir Putin. In my view, I see South Africa doing nothing about President Vladimir Putin for various political, economic, and a lot of other reasons, short of the fact that arresting the sitting president of the country with the most nuclear weapons is surely signing a death warrant.
Indeed. Well, notwithstanding the fact that I think when we look at SA relations with Russia and more recent developments, for instance, those naval drills, those naval exercises that were conducted with Russia and China just last month, and how much sort of public attention that garnered from the West, feeling as though South Africa was alienating itself from Western countries, it does seem clear that South Africa has positioned itself as a country that wishes to strengthen its bilateral ties with Russia, potentially at the risk of some sort of political fallout with the West. It seems as though South Africa has weighed its options and risks and has decided to take on a particular stance and hold on to that stance.
And because of that decision was made a long time ago, and various documents, resolutions, and policies of the African National Congress attest to that. The United States, did also not do itself a favor by the way that it withdrew, and some would argue dumped, Afghanistan. That was a huge lesson to many countries that intend to cooperate with the United States in the future. Look also at Pakistan. For over 20 years, Pakistan was a strong ally of the United States fighting the war in Afghanistan. Overnight, Pakistan moved from being the most supported country by the United States to being the most sanctioned state by the United States. So other countries in the world are looking at how the United States treats or mistreats its allies. And they are taking lessons, and they are comparing, and they are choosing sides. Right now, I think for South Africa, it has to continue with its strategy of sticking out with members of the Global South, developing the BRICS conglomerate into something that is worth mentioning when we speak about multipolarity. It is not time for South Africa to try and re-appease the West, because no matter how much you appease the West, if it no longer has a strategic use for you, they will leave within 24 hours, literally, as we saw in Afghanistan. So having those drills, MOST 1 and MOST 2, I think that is the right thing for South Africa to do, because like the United States, South Africa must put its national interest first and stop worrying about about what the United States thinks about South Africa, because the United States is less worrying about what South Africa thinks about it.
All right, so you've touched on this, the topical conversation around, redesigning the global order, and South Africa clearly hitching itself to Russia and the global South as that being part of its strategic sort of approach to this new world order that is likely to, come about come 2050 or so. That's the prediction. But I want to talk about this charm offensive that we saw from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov coming to visit South Africa, Angola, getting into conversations with Eritrea as well. Clearly African leaders are following a similar approach to South Africa, hitching themselves to Russia to a certain extent. I'm curious about this sentiment, Prof, that, these great powers are coming to Africa to compete on this terrain. Are our African leaders sensitive, aware, and alive to those sentiments, and are they responding adequately?
Ntokozo, I think there is an incremental awareness among African leaders of the need to put Africa first. We see that in the West African region, where France has been told to vacate, and France is no longer part of the peacekeeping mission in the Sahel region. And we also see that happening at the citizen-to-citizen level. Just last week, there was a march by citizens from Ouagadougou to Bamako demanding that those two countries be merged into one country. So African leaders are aware of the need to put their people first. However, it is the colonial legacy, which others term coloniality, which is still a huge hindrance. And this is where the likes of China and Russia come in to try and extricate Africa from that colonial matrix of power. If I may use the example of West Africa again, you will realize that most of them use a currency that is called the CFA franc, which is a France-controlled currency. When about 18 West African countries got independence or were granted independence literally by President Charles de Gaulle, some of them did not even want to be independent. I remember the first president of Cote d'Ivoire, Hifet Bounye, he was running Cote d'Ivoire and his offices were in Paris. So we are seeing it's a huge transition from where we were when Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere were arguing about whether to go the continentalist route or the nationalist route, to where we are today, where African countries can tell the likes of France to pack and go. And I think South Africa has got a role to play here as one of the leading nations in Africa. South Africa has a role to play in terms of charting the way, and I view this as a very positive development that South Africa not only talks about leading Africa, but actually leads Africa from entering into the right partnerships.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe this is the right way to create multipolarity.
Right. Well, that's good and well, Prof. But, you highlighted for us earlier those sort of economic power dynamics within BRICS, the BRICS structure, South Africa's GDP being the smallest out of all of those countries. And so in terms of, having a seat at the table, while South Africa may have a seat at the table, as an economic powerhouse, it isn't on quite the same level as the other countries mentioned. And so as it makes these political strides in pressing forward with Africa's agenda, in liaising itself with the global south and countries such as Russia and China in order to form part of this redesigned global order, how much of that is likely to suffer because economically we aren't operating and sustaining ourselves at the same level as our counterparts?
We may not be on the same level with other four members of the BRICS bloc. However, my view of South Africa is not that of South Africa, but of Africa. Africa as an entry point into South Africa. So by associating themselves with South Africa, what the former BRIC countries were doing, were looking at a strategic partner who gives them a very good lending into Africa. And there was no better partner than South Africa. So when South Africa is sitting at the table with other BRICS members, it is not only sitting there as South Africa, it is sitting there representing Africa. So when we want to look at the potential that South Africa contributes to the BRICS, we must look at that in terms of what South Africa brings with it to the table, which is the whole of Africa. And we are talking here about all the rare earth minerals, all the human resources in Africa, all the fertile soil, all the resources. I think that is the power that South Africa wields within the BRICS conglomerate.
All right. Well, Prof, thank you so much for your time coming on to our program this morning and sharing all of your insights with us. That was Prof. Everisto Benyera, who is with the Department of African Politics at the University of South Africa.